So when talking about genetic algorithms, most people tend to use an analogy and terminology which is inspired by biology and evolution. And that's because the idea for this type of algorithm was inspired by the Darwinian theory of evolution and survival of the fittest. So most of the time you'll be hearing words like mutation and recombination and other words that might be a little bit unfamiliar to us in data science. So what exactly is a genetic algorithm? Let's go over some of the basics in the terms that we're more familiar with. They're learning algorithms, kind of like gradient descent, but different in many respects. So they're typically used to decide which variables you want to include in your model when you have a lot of different variables. They're also used in some cases to fit a model, so they're used to determine the different coefficients you should be using for these variables. But in our case, we're not going to be exploring that. And the last thing I want to mention is that these algorithms use three basic mechanisms called crossover, mutation, and selection, which we're going to look at in greater detail now. First, we're going to start with a pool of random solutions. And what do I mean by solutions? Essentially, I mean a series of bits, which are either ones or zeros, to represent whether the variable that you can include in your model will be included. So say you had 200 different variables you wanted to choose from. This algorithm is going to give a 1 or a 0 to the variables that it's going to test in the model. And when I say that the initial pool of solutions has to be random, I mean you could have 50 different solutions down here. So you could have 50 different assortments of ones and zeros for your 200 variables. And they need to be different because that'll let the algorithm go through the search space very effectively. Once you have a pool of solutions, the algorithm then proceeds to creating new solutions based off that pool in a process called crossover. And this is essentially like the reproductive aspect of the analogy, where you use those initial solutions, which we'll call parents, to create new solutions, which we'll call children. If you look at these pictures on the right, you'll see that there are many different ways in which you can create the children. So for example, you can specify that each children will inherit 50% of the parent. And so what you end up with is these solutions right here. You can also specify that the bits from the parents are randomly mixed up and you end up with these different children which are essentially jumbles of the parents. After the crossover has occurred, the next mechanism which takes place is called mutation. And this is essentially the chance that a bit within one of our solution gets flipped from a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0. And usually this probability is quite small. So what ends up happening is each of the solutions has some small chance of just having one of their values randomly changed. And this is a good way for the algorithm to introduce some random degree of chaos. Now, the last mechanism which takes place is called selection. And typically what ends up happening here is you've predefined some fitness function by which to evaluate all of the solutions. And for every solution that you have, the children and the parents, some score is associated based on this fitness function. Now, sometimes in the selection process, you also want to account for diversity because you want fit solutions which are also very different from each other. But typically the way it works is all of the different fitness scores are ranked, and then they have some probability of getting passed on to the next generation of this process. And the ones with low fitness typically get cut, so they don't get considered for the next iteration of this process. So let's try and visualize this process now that we've seen all the mechanisms. Essentially, you start with a population of random solutions. So this is our initial pool, and there's a good degree of variance in here so that when we get to the crossover stage, we can come up with new solutions which are very different. And then some degree of mutation occurs where bits are randomly flipped. And then you end up with this new population of children and parents. From there, you evaluate all the children and parents and you come up with their fitness values. You rank these different fitness values and you select the ones that get to reproduce, so the ones that get passed on to the next generations. And the process repeats with crossover, mutation, and then evaluation of the population again. And this whole process iterates over and over again until convergence. And typically you specify what convergence is. So you specify what the final outcome should look like.